This is Terms of Reference podcast number 172.
Unfortunately, we oftentimes find that institutions of higher education are not currently set up to really maximize the potential or the impact and solutions that these students can create throughout their lives. Watson is a new model of higher education with a singular focus to design a curriculum and an experience that truly unlocks and unleashes the potential and the power of the next generation.
This is Terms of Reference. I'm your host, Stephen Laddick. Long ago, in the days of yore, when I was completing high school and looking to what was next, college was the path of least resistance. Unfortunately, as it turned out, following that path put me on a trajectory that would take 3 colleges, many majors, and an embarrassing amount of tuition to finally spit me out the other side with a degree. And here's the kicker. Like so many others, when I was a newly minted graduate, I still really didn't have a clue about how to engage with the problems I wanted to help solve. That took another 5 years to figure out, and it's a story for another time. So, long story short, whenever I hear about a new or innovative approach to higher education, especially one that engages students rather than locking them into a system, I want to know more. My guest for the 172nd Terms of Reference podcast, Eric Glustrom, is the CEO and president of Watson. Watson is a new university model tailored for next-generation innovators, leaders, and social entrepreneurs. Eric tells us Watson protects the courage of the next generation so they can pioneer their education, trailblaze lives as innovators, and contribute to solving the toughest challenges facing the world. I'm hoping you'll be as inspired as I was recording this interview with Eric, and left with the hope that all of our institutions of higher education can become more learner-driven in the future. I spoke with Eric in Boulder. But before we get started, a quick word from our sponsor.
The Terms of Reference podcast is sponsored by International Solutions Group, helping to improve the social impact of governments, UN agencies, NGOs, and companies for more than 10 years. Visit ISG online at www.theisg.com. Hello,
Eric. Thank you so much for being on the Terms of Reference podcast today.
Hi, Stephen. Thanks so much for having me.
Eric, I know we talked before the show, before we started recording this. I know where you are, but tell us, so that I can be jealous once again, where you're sitting right now.
Yeah, I'm lucky to be sitting here in beautiful Chautauqua Park in Boulder, Colorado. It's right next to the Rocky Mountains. That's where Watson's campus is based. It's a beautiful day, evening here right now, so the sun is setting over the mountains.
Oh, it's gorgeous. It's, we're recording this sort of in mid-September. Looking at fall in the Rockies, it is a distant dream to me, but we love it. You mentioned Watson. Why don't you, as we always start every show, rather than having me butcher what Watson's all about, why don't you tell us what Watson is?
Yeah, definitely. So I think the best way to start is that we believe that Watson is based on a few beliefs. And the first is that the world and humanity is faced with significant challenges currently. And if we as people are going to reach our full potential, if we are going to be able to find the full potential that humanity has, we need to solve these problems. Poverty, climate change, inequality, a lot of the diseases that are affecting people around the world. And we also believe that the people with the most potential to solve these problems, if we take a step back, people with the most potential to solve these problems throughout their lifetimes are currently within the walls of institutions of higher education around the world, our world's best and brightest. Unfortunately, we oftentimes find that institutions of higher education are not currently set up to really maximize the potential or maximize the impact and solutions that these students can create throughout their lives. And so Watson is a new model of higher education with a singular focus. And that focus is to design a model, design a program, design a curriculum and an experience that truly unlocks and unleashes the potential and the power of the next generation to create social change, to bring solutions to the problems that they are passionate about solving. So we're based here in Boulder, Colorado. We select a small number of young social entrepreneurs each semester to join us, and they each come with a specific idea, specific solution, and then our model helps them to build those ideas, maximize the impact that they can create, and probably most importantly, really start to trailblaze their lives, trailblaze their careers of impact.
Before we dive into those specific impact stories, which I want to hear a bunch of them if we can, contrast for me what a traditional institution would be. Like, what's the different model that you're putting on the street?
Definitely. And I think everyone has their own individual story of what their higher education experience looked like. And there's as many stories as there are people, so there's definitely not a singular story. I'll share some about my experience when I was in college. And I was fortunate to go to a great liberal arts school, Amherst College in the Northeast here in the US. And at Amherst, I had a great experience, was very challenged intellectually, challenged physically through athletics, grew a lot during my time there. However, most of my classes were, of course, focused on the research interests of my professors. And the work that I was truly passionate about, which was starting an organization called Educate, which I started back when I was in high school, and Educate would later become my career. That's the work I was really passionate about. And I found that the work I did with Educate happened not even as an extracurricular, but it happened after sports, after homework, after clubs. It really happened from midnight till 2 a.m., right? Or it happened during the summers when I would go to East Africa where Educate's work is based. And, what I found is that not only was Educate what I was most passionate about, but it also became my career when I graduated. And it also is theoretically what's had the most impact in the world. And so if those things are true, why is it not more of a core part of my educational experience? It became my career. It's theoretically what's had the most impact, and it's what I'm most passionate about. It's what I've learned the most from. And so we believe at Watson that those ideas, the passions that students come in with, should really be at the core of their educational experience. And that's how we've designed our entire model.
One of the questions I had teed up for us was why social entrepreneurship? Why not engineering, or why not chemistry, or some other discipline to solve the world's problems? You've chosen essentially a business discipline, right? Of leadership, of problem solving, to for lack of a better term. And you took us down the path of Educate. How did did someone show up when you were in high school and say, hey, you know what, you seem like a passionate young guy, and why don't you start this? Or who gave you that boost to get into Educate and start Educate? And most high schoolers aren't thinking about East Africa. Like, how did that come
Definitely.
about?
Yeah, definitely. Let me answer the first question first around the business discipline piece. There's engineering. I studied neuroscience and biochemistry when I was in college. And we firmly believe that to solve significant problems around the world, we need engineers, we need scientists, we need artists, we need poets, we need philosophers. And we see entrepreneurship as more of a fundamental skill that they can then be applied in each of these different disciplines. And so we really believe that entrepreneurship is not an either or with other technical paths, so to speak, but rather is the foundation, and a foundation that hopefully allows our students to unleash these lifetimes of impact, during which they will bring in engineering, they will bring in philosophy, and maybe that's through their own development as individuals, maybe it's through hiring people onto their team who have great experience in those areas and those skill sets. But we do see entrepreneurship, entrepreneurial thinking, entrepreneurial action, entrepreneurial problem solving as that core foundational skill.
And what about you getting your kickstart? And I apologize for the compound question, but when you were in high school, did you have either a mentor or a teacher or someone just say, hey, look, don't wait, get started now, go do this?
Yeah, it's a great and very relevant question. So when I was in high school, I was very fortunate to meet a woman named Angela Timondino, who is still a close friend to this day. It's been 15 years since then. And Angela was on the board of Amnesty International, the large human rights organization of Amnesty International here in the US back at that time. And she helped me to learn about a scholarship opportunity that Amnesty offers for high school and college students to design and implement human rights projects somewhere around the world. The scholarship is called the Patrick Stewart Human Rights Scholarship. Patrick Stewart being the excellent British actor who has been in everything from Star Trek to X-Men.
I was going to say, shut up. Is it literally Jean-Luc Picard? Is that
the Jean-Luc Picard? Exactly. So,
that is awesome. I had no idea he funded a scholarship. That's fantastic.
That's right. Exactly. And so I was captivated by the idea, which is, I would imagine, why Patrick Stewart created this scholarship, because there were no requirements on it in terms of the geographic area or the field it had to be in. It was an open, really a blank canvas for students to design human rights projects anywhere in the world. I was captivated by the ability to just think up a project somewhere, anywhere in the world that I hadn't been to before, and apply to Amnesty to see if they would fund me to do this. And so I spent a lot of time going through a bunch of different ideas, options, locations, etc. And finally, came to the idea, which was to make a film in a refugee community in Western Uganda, because I thought that would be the best way specifically to help my fellow students here in Boulder, Colorado, what life was like on the other side of the world. And so I went through the whole process of developing the trip and had the day-to-day itinerary, received permission from the government of Uganda to enter the refugee camp, and of course included all of this in my application to the Patrick Stewart Human Rights Scholarship. And I remember I was supposed to leave early June 2002, and maybe a month before I was supposed to get on the plane, I received a note from Amnesty International saying, we're sorry, but you're too young and this project is too dangerous. We are not going to be able to fund it.
Shut up. They shut you down by telling you, that's interesting. Even though this is the scholarship opportunity, you're not the one.
Exactly. And so I was, of course, I don't know about disappointed, but I was not sure about what to do next because my parents were obviously concerned about this. I was planning to go to a refugee community in Western Uganda on my own, age 17. I had never been before, with people who I'd never met before, who I, had planned to meet once I was there. And so I remember I called up Angela, who now I look back on it, I'm like, yes, Angela was what an ideal mentor should be. So I called her and she said, well, why don't you just go anyways? It's okay that Amnesty isn't going to fund it. Why don't you just go anyways? And so that's what I did. And I remember I finally convinced my parents. I took out a small loan for, I believe, for the video camera, and ended up June of 2002 getting let off of a bus in this refugee community, not knowing a single person around me. And I looked around and there was a really kind-looking young man about my age sitting on a rock wall. And we locked eyes and I walked over and said hello and introduced myself. And his name is Benson. And Benson became my best friend while I was there for a month in his community. He's a refugee from the Congo. I, ate with him, walked around the community with him. He helped translate. We worked on the film together. And I always say I learned a few things, more than a few things, but I learned that making a film is much harder than it sounds. So the film became a home video. But what I did come away with was, on one of the last evenings that I was there, I was with a small group, including Benson, and they were telling me about their vision for the Congo, the country that they come from. And it was clear to me that if anyone was going to solve the problems in the Congo, these were the people to do it. They had been through the conflict there. They had fled to Uganda. Their lives have been indelibly affected by this war. They're more motivated than anyone else to solve it. So I really said, well, what is it that I can do to help? It's clear that you all have the potential, that if anyone's going to be able to solve this, it's you. What can I do to help? And they responded with some words that very much changed my life and my philosophy on education, because they said the best way to help our community and the best way to help our country is to help us receive an education. And I have to tell you, when I went there, education was the last thing on my mind. Mm-hmm. For me, education was just something we did, partially because I come from a fortunate family. We went to middle school so we can go to high school so you can go to college, and then you get a job. That was what I thought of as the purpose of education. Once I heard this statement from Benson and two other gentlemen who were there that night, it became very clear to me that education should be an investment in the next generation that pays off for all of us, that pays off for the future of humanity. And in this specific case, that would pay off for the future of the Congo and the communities where they came from and that have been so torn apart by conflict. So that was the launching pad for what became a long journey of starting Educate.
That is a wonderful story, and one that I know many of our listeners can attach themselves to, right, relate with, because these are people on this show. Many, many times we've talked about, if you want to do this kind of work, if you want to help people, sometimes the best option you have is just to get on the airplane with your backpack and go do it. And I'm really glad to hear that success story. And what you find as well is that, most of the time, rather than changing other people's lives, especially in that initial moment, you end up changing, and that's how it works.
Without a doubt.
So as you've changed and as you evolved, You started Watson, you're sitting now in Boulder. How are you breaking and bending this educational system? So you told us earlier about focusing on the passion of the student, focusing on, a social problem that they want to solve. But what are the nuts and bolts behind that? I mean, is it just a semester program? Is it a full degree? Take us more through what are the nuts and bolts about what somebody receives when they come to Watson.
Right, definitely. And let me just share a little bit about the background and the story too of how it started, because, after the ideas for Educate came together, I think you mentioned that sometimes the best way to move forward is just to go and learn, go into the community and figure out what's going on and what makes sense. And I think that's exactly what I did. And when I was in college, I met several people, including Boris Bulayev, who later became my co-founder with Educate, who is now currently running the organization as it's continuing to grow and make significant impact in the education systems of East Africa. But there were 5 years from 2002 until 2007, 2008, 5 or 6 years where we were only working with a small group of 20 to 25 students. And what we were doing during this time was learning a ton about not only these students and their lives, but we were learning about the education system in East Africa. And we found that people like Benson with tremendous potential to make change in their communities when they were in school, they were learning things like the regions of Germany, because that was part of the national exams. So they were memorizing the regions of Germany, which was so far
super relevant
from being relevant. Exactly. From what their vision and what their purpose in life is, which is such an important vision, such an important purpose. And we knew that if we really wanted to develop the leaders of tomorrow, the next generation who's going to solve these conflicts and these significant problems, that we needed to do more than just increase access to the education system. We needed to actually fundamentally change the outcomes of the education system itself. So starting 5-6 years later, 2007, 2008, that's exactly what we did. And we've since developed a model of education in East Africa that we believe, and we've seen very strong evidence for this, not only lifts the students that we're working with out of poverty because they now have the entrepreneurial skills to move themselves out of poverty, but they're also able to make an impact and start to build their communities and solve the problems that their communities are facing. And this is a model that we have now both expanded into hundreds of schools across Uganda, Rwanda, and starting this year in Kenya. But also we've worked with the government of Uganda and Rwanda and now Kenya to bring in the evidence of the Educate model, why it works. With the help of a lot of third-party evaluations, we have very strong evidence of the impact that this model has. And we've been able to bring in that evidence to the government and say, currently, the education system is producing job seekers, yet there are no jobs out there. And so as these hundreds of thousands of students graduate from high school, from secondary school, without a strong chance of going on to university, there's going to be a massive youth unemployment crisis, which already exists and is growing. And we've seen what happens in the Middle East as youth unemployment grows. And so the government, surprisingly, really bought into the idea. We found that we were addressing one of the major pain points that the governments knew they were facing. And so we've been able to integrate the curriculum that Educate provides into the secondary education system, both in Uganda and also now in Rwanda through our partnership with the government of Uganda, the National Curriculum Development Center, and then also the government of Rwanda. We're looking forward to leading a similar process in Kenya. And this was all happening between 2008 and 2012. So at this point, Educate had been operating for about 10 years and countless stories of the impact our students were making. But I sat back in 2011, 2012, and I said, why is it that governments in East Africa have caught on to this? And the education system here has fundamentally changed. Whereas the education system I went through back in the US does not provide the same opportunities for students that we've been able to provide here in East Africa, right? And it was really weighing on me because I knew that the model we were developing needed to be implemented globally, and it was not just specific to East Africa. And so that was where the spark of the idea for Watson came from.
Then take us to, from the spark to actually getting it started. Was it another grant? I know you've been an Ashoka Fellow, you've been a Echoing Green Fellow, etc. Was it something like that ultimately got you connected to people to starting this? I mean, you already had the curriculum, so was it basically laying out that curriculum and then finding a space? Was it finding a champion within a traditional university? What was the next move?
Yeah. Well, I think I was fortunate to have another mentor named Aditya Nataraj, who is from India, and he runs the Gandhi Fellowship in India. And Aditya is like my hero, right? He's one of the most successful educational entrepreneurs in India, has scaled an amazing organization across a very large country. And he called me and said, "Hey, Eric, I'm taking a sabbatical. It's going to be a 3-month sabbatical, and I would like to spend 6 weeks of it, half of it, in Uganda with you and your team." And I was absolutely floored. This is like, I cherished every hour that I got with Aditya leading up to that call. And then here he is saying, "I'd like to spend 6 weeks in Uganda with you and with your team." And Aditya's time in Uganda was very, very influential for me and for our team. And one thing that it helped me to realize is that our team was very much ready to take the organization forward. It also helped me to realize how strong my desire was to do this type of work in the US. And so I always feel extremely fortunate that Aditya made that trip and took that sabbatical with us, because it helped me to put those pieces together. And by putting those pieces together, it made a lot of sense to say to my co-founders, Boris, Angelica, and then the rest of the amazing team that we had built, they were beyond ready to take the organization forward. And I was beyond ready to say, how do we take the fundamentals of this model we've developed over in East Africa and bring it back to the US? That was the spark that said, let's get Watson going. And we then went through a design process, and my goal was to have one learning conversation a day for 6 months straight with somebody with great expertise in the education space here in the US around what's the current landscape, where are the levers for change. And, at some point during that design process, the ideas for Watson very much crystallized, and we decided to focus on higher education because, one, firmly believe that higher education is at a crucial point in its evolution. And two, like we talked about before, so much potential is locked up within the next generation who are currently within the walls of higher education institutions. And if we can find a way to unleash all of that potential, it really can change the course of humanity in the future. So,
is the current point of the evolution of the higher education system, are you referring to, the advent of online education, virtual universities? I assume that's a piece of it. What other factors are a part of that evolution right now in your mind?
Definitely. It's a multifaceted answer, but it's actually, the core is more of an undercurrent. There's been a lot around online higher ed, how that's disrupting the system. People are talking about student debt as the next bubble because we have more student debt in the US than we do credit card debt. So we know the financial model needs to change. The delivery model, there's been a lot of experiments with online. We really believe that there's an undercurrent that is actually the core of what needs to change. And that, again, is looking at what are the outcomes of higher education? Mm-hmm. What are the outcomes of the system itself? What is it designed? What is it set up to do? And I think a lot of the original vision and mission of the higher education institutions we have today, we've drifted away from the original mission and vision, and the outcomes have become very different, both on the liberal arts front, but also on the more vocational front. And so at Watson, we said, currently, let's take a step back. Currently, as people, we are faced with existential problems. The people with the most impact to solve these problems are within the walls of higher education institutions. So what would it look like to take a blank canvas and design, from scratch, learning from best practices, what the next evolution of the higher education model looks like, with a specific focus, a singular focus on maximizing the impact, maximizing the solutions, maximizing the entrepreneurial talent that the next generation can demonstrate throughout their lifetimes.
So take us to how that looks in Watson today. You've been evolving, obviously, for the past several years yourself. What can they expect to get through your program? How does it different, and how's the outcome-based focus of it change what they're ultimately learning and what the process is that they go through?
Exactly. One student who comes to mind who I think is very representative of what Watson is all about, and also of the different type of experience that Watson is aiming to provide, is a student who came through Watson in fall of 2014 named Patrick Metier. And Patrick is a young entrepreneur. He was walking through the frozen food aisle one day in his local grocery store, and he thought to himself, why is it that we can't buy local frozen produce? There's a lot of frozen produce and we have a lot of local fresh produce, but for some reason we can't buy local frozen produce. And this has a lot of implications. One, it means that we can't buy local year round, right? Two, it means that farmers who would be able to sell a lot of their excess crops for frozen foods, our current local farmers are currently unable to do so. And he said, I'm going to look into this more and figure out why there isn't local frozen produce, and two, if there's anything I can do about it. And he came to Watson with the idea for Seal the Seasons. And while he was here in Boulder, where our campus is based, in Chautauqua Park, he actually built his first flash freezer right outside of our equivalent of a dorm room, Columbine Lodge. And I remember Patrick calling me one day and saying, do you by any chance know where I can find some liquid nitrogen?
Of course.
And we worked to connect him with some people who could provide liquid nitrogen. He pieced together some PVC pipes, and with the help of a few of his fellow Watson scholars, he built his first flash freezer. By the end of that semester, he was selling on a pilot prototype level local frozen produce here in Boulder, and was validating his assumptions, was validating his business model, was validating his theory of change, was validating that this is, one, a real opportunity, two, a real problem, both in terms of the global food situation where food comes from all over the place, but also in terms of local farmers who are currently not receiving a lot of income for the excess produce that they're harvesting that they could. And so, over the next several months, Patrick built the idea, started building his team, started selling in more stores. So then by the beginning of 2016, he was selling in 25 grocery stores around North Carolina, where he's from. Great early proof of concept. By the end of 2016, he was selling in over 500 stores around North Carolina and had raised over $1 million in capital for Seal the Seasons, had built a professional team behind the company, and he's continued to grow Seal the Seasons into what it is today. And I use Patrick's story as an example because for a few reasons, but one of the things that Patrick says about his experience at Watson is that it gave him the space to explore the idea that he had and had a passion for and believed was important to see happen in this world. Watson gave him the space to jump into this idea full time, to explore it, to see where it could go. And we do this through the Watson Lab. The Watson Lab feels like a co-working space where the scholars are surrounded by mentors, are surrounded by a coach that Watson, through a process that Watson designs, so that next generation who have ideas that they want to see how those ideas can look in real life have an actual space to build those ideas out. And that happens in the Watson Lab. But we also, in addition to that space, provide the training. So there's curriculum, both in personal development, which is absolutely crucial for young entrepreneurs, but also in terms of the hard skills of entrepreneurship. Everything from rapid prototyping to fundraising to team building to business model validation to the ideation process and design thinking. What are the skills that young entrepreneurs need to make an impact and to take their ideas forward? And then finally, I think just to emphasize the community here at Watson is so powerful. So, we saw this with Patrick's fellow classmates helping him to build his first flash freezer. But what we find is we select a small group of students from all over the world, 25 students each semester, very carefully selected, a selection rate on par with many Ivy League institutions. And those students come together from all over the world with ideas, with tons of talent, raw potential, and passion. And the collaborations, the shared energy that comes from that peer community is absolutely, for me, one of the highlights of Watson and one of the most impactful things that we do. We've seen that turn into not only strong friendships, but partnerships, as many scholars have teamed up in what they're doing. And that the peer community, being able to be surrounded by like-minded entrepreneurs and thinkers is so important, because normally a student like Patrick is going to feel a bit like the black sheep. He's going to be very much taking the road less traveled. And the road less traveled is never easy, but it's much easier when you can be surrounded by a very committed, passionate group of peers.
Tell me about the people who want to be in the social sector who aren't interested in leadership opportunities. I'm of the opinion that there's still the vast majority of people who are like, hey, I'm cool with getting a job and I'd like to do something good and everything like that. But, I want to be a cog, right? For lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do you plug into that? And does that not enter your focus, or is that how you're building out, helping them to think about building out companies, or just speak to that for a second?
Definitely. In the same way that many institutions have different majors, we think of our majors or our concentrations as being different paths to create social change, different vehicles to create social change. So our first major, so to speak, is entrepreneurship. It's not for everyone, but it is for students like Patrick who have an idea that they want to build out, and they know they want that to be a significant part of their college experience and their future careers because they're passionate about solving those problems. The second major equivalent that we're in the middle of developing currently is intrapreneurship. So intrapreneurship means someone who uses entrepreneurial thinking, entrepreneurial skill sets to make change happen, but to do so within another organization or within an institution or within a company, but they are not necessarily the founder of that company, right? So in many cases, a great saying that I heard is, to start a successful organization or a company, you'd always need a nut and a rock. A nut, someone who's crazy enough to think it's possible, and then a rock, someone who can ground the idea in reality and test those assumptions. And the intrapreneurship track, we hope, will be a track here at Watson whereby members of the next generation who are deeply committed and deeply passionate about solving a problem, but are not convinced that they want to do so through entrepreneurship, can come through the Watson experience, the Watson environment, the Watson community, and really map out the system in which this problem exists and identify where they can best fit into that system. It might be through, there are apprenticeships as a key part of this, apprenticeships within organizations and companies solving that problem, but they might go on to find out that actually through research, actually through policy change, or actually through joining another organization or company is the vehicle that best suits them to make a dent in this problem they're trying to solve. And that's what the intrapreneurship track is set up to do. It's for those who are not yet sure that starting a venture is the best way to solve the problem that they're passionate about, but they know that part of their purpose in life is about solving this specific problem.
I'm totally going to steal the nut and the rock story, just so you know. I mean, that's
great.
That's good. We'll have to find out who to attribute it to, but that's a new one for me. I like it.
Who to attribute it to. It's actually to a wonderful Watson mentor named Sue Kuntz, who the first time she told it to me was over coffee. And, she said, hey, Eric, in any venture, there needs to be a nut and a rock. And she told me about what the difference between the two are, how the nuts are usually the crazy ones. And she said, all I know is that you are not the rock. And I was like, okay, I see what you're saying here. So, so we can attribute that to Sue Kuntz for sure.
Super cool. And, well, I'm a fellow nut, so don't worry. You're in good company.
Excellent.
This couldn't have been, the last 5 years building Watson. We know that it's not all smiles and sunshine and people saying, oh my God, no one else has ever thought of this before. Let me give you tons of money to do this. What are the barriers that you've had to building this organization? I'm thinking pushback from traditional universities. I mean, you're sitting next to, University of Colorado. You're sitting next to Colorado State University. Around the world, you're competing with traditional universities, online universities, just setting up and attracting and showing kids, sorry, for the lack of a better term, that you have a value that they're going to be able to walk away with that then they can show to the world, then it means something. What are the biggest hurdles that you've had to overcome, and what are you looking at overcoming now?
Definitely. Yeah, I think the process is not easy, and it is kind of nail biting in a lot of ways, right? There's a lot of moments where we might be facing an external challenge, which I can name a dozen that have come up. There's also a lot of moments where internally we look at what we're doing and we question, is this actually the right thing to do? Are we actually addressing the root cause of the problem we're solving? Are we moving in the right direction? And both these internal challenges, but also the external challenges none of them are easy. And I think, and this is something we talk with the Watson scholars about a lot, entrepreneurship might be the hip term and path, but it is 100% not the easy one. And so if somebody is looking for the easy path, then we always say, this is not for you. It's going to be hard, and it's not going to be quick either. It's definitely not going to be quick. And I think I've learned that personally through the work with Educate. I've definitely learned that in new ways through the work with Watson, but then seeing the impact that comes from it and knowing that we're on a very important mission makes it worthwhile. There's been a lot of challenges. I think one that comes to mind was finding and navigating the academic landscape, especially when it comes to accreditation and partnerships with institutions. So our first semester, we did partner with CU, which is just down the hill from us. CU is a great state school, and we were fortunate to build that partnership with them our first semester here at Watson. And it quickly became clear that that was not a partnership that would be able to last into the future. CU is not set up to partner with a small, innovative, very kind of agile effort like Watson. And
break that down for just a second, though, because, you may have just described what, my intuition would tell me you have just described the vast majority of existing well-known brands in higher education, right? Is that just, are they not set up because, as you described, Watson, it's small, it's startup, it's agile, it's, iterative, it's et cetera, whereas CU's got a process and they've got a brand and they have a system. Is that just those two universes are oil and water, or is there something really specific that the reason why that relationship wouldn't last for a longer term?
Right. Well, one story that comes to mind is I was sitting in one of the administrators' offices at CU, who was one of the leads on the partnership, and he had the organization chart of CU behind him. And I think we were looking at it and talking about it. And while we were talking, I counted up the layers in this organization chart. And I got to 13 layers within the bureaucracy of CU.
Sweet. Sure.
And then he told me, oh, and by the way, this isn't even the full organization chart. Right? So we're talking at least 13 layers within the institution, which means that if something needs to change, or if a student's education is not matched to their experience, or if their education is not matched to their future career prospects and the market and the problems that they will be forced to solve throughout their lifetimes, it needs to go through 13 layers before significant systematic changes can be made within the institution. And so the likelihood of those innovations taking hold is very, very small. And, that's one element of it. We believe at Watson as well, I think this is oftentimes overlooked challenge that comes with student debt. And our higher education system here in the US, whether we like it or not, is largely driven by debt. And I think there's a lot of issues with this. The fact that it burdens graduates down with 5 figures of debt when they graduate, that their early career decisions are being influenced by the fact that they need to pay off their debt, and therefore they choose jobs and career paths in those crucial early days after graduating that are not aligned fully with who they are, but it was a choice made because they want to pay off their student debt. Those are all big issues with student debt. We believe there's another issue that is potentially even more important, more harmful, which is that there is no accountability link between the institution and the students and alumni when it is a model based off of debt, because the institutions receive the funds up front and then the students graduate, they're forced to pay back that debt, and the institution itself is not incentivized to care how or if the alumni are able to pay back that debt. So therefore, if their education is not producing a good return on investment for the students or for the world, then there's no sort of feedback system, feedback loop that forces the education to change. And when there's no forcing function, then there's no better forcing function than a strong revenue model. When there's no forcing function, then things stagnate, right? Change only happens when people get behind new directions. Change doesn't happen naturally. And so as a result, our higher education system has largely stagnated for decades, and it does not look significantly different than it did 50, 100 years ago, yet the world has changed dramatically. Mm-hmm. And we think one of the root causes of this is the fact that the student debt model actually breaks the accountability link between the student and the alumni and the institution. So what we do at Watson to address this is an innovative income sharing program. And income sharing is a model that was piloted and has been adopted by many coding schools. It was first proposed by Milton Friedman back in the 1950s, and it's just starting to take hold and build momentum now In short, income sharing means that students don't need to pay tuition up front and they don't need to go into debt to complete their education. But they do agree to share a percentage of their future income with Watson for a set number of years. And that means that we are now accountable to our alumni. If our alumni are not successful, then neither are we. And therefore, we feel as an institution if our alumni are not being successful, and we know that we need to change something. And so that revenue model in and of itself has allowed us to really design and tailor the model to the students that we're working with. But, I think just going back to our main point of finding the right partner, when we realized that CU, which is a great state school, is not set up and not designed to work with Watson and an organization like Watson, we were very lucky to find and be connected with a highly innovative, highly entrepreneurial institution in South Florida called Lynn University. Lynn University is unlike any other institution of higher education I've ever worked with. It's more innovative and more entrepreneurial than many tech startups. Yet it is a 45-year-old private liberal arts school that is very much driving forward what I believe is the future of higher ed. Rather than pursuing independent accreditation, we've built a partnership with Lynn to create Watson Institute at Lynn University, which will enable the students coming through Watson to earn their accredited degrees from Lynn University. And we've partnered with Lynn for about 3.5 years now. And one of the big next steps that we're taking is to actually create our second campus on Lynn University's campus down in the very interesting, very diverse, very active entrepreneurial scene in South Florida.
Which, that'll be interesting. Maybe there's going to be a whole bunch of people who show up ready to do flood relief and hurricane relief, right?
Our team already had to take cover from the hurricane. Luckily, everyone's safe, but there's still a lot of cleanup and flood recovery going on.
This episode will air, weeks after the hurricane. Obviously, relief efforts will happen probably while this airs. But I'm just thinking of the student body at Lynn. That could be something that's really on their mind of helping to solve that problem, right? Urban environments and natural disasters are kind of oil and water in that way. How does your financial model, I love the idea of Watson sort of keeping skin in the game for, someone who's graduated. Does that, I'm not sure if this is a sensitive question, but so are you a wholly independent financial entity from Lynn? Or is Lynn also bearing some of that risk? Or I'm just wondering, how would that work?
Yeah, great question. So we are a separate entity from Lynn. So Lynn does not bear that risk, but we as Watson take that on. And I think the risk is the key term here. And what income sharing does is that it de-risks the education for the student. And it's my belief that for far too long, the risk of higher ed and that massive investment that the next generation makes, in many cases, the largest single purchase that definitely students will have made in their lifetimes to date when they go to school, but in many cases, the largest purchase they will make for a good part of their life, risk of that investment has been completely borne by the student. And income sharing allows us to de-risk
it's more of a risk.
education.
It's almost like, hey, you have the privilege of coming here rather than we have the privilege of serving you, right?
Exactly.
Maybe I don't know if I'm speaking out of turn here since I went to university way too long ago, but it sounds to me like that's the attitude that still exists.
Definitely. And I think that a system with such a fundamental flaw in the underlying revenue model is inherently unsustainable. And so I think we're going to see a lot more institutions, either because they choose to do it, because they as an institution believe it's part of their mission, or because they're forced to do it, start to take on the risk that their students are signing up for when they sign up for their education there. And that's going to be a very helpful trend within higher ed.
Do you see on the other side, I'm thinking 5 years from now for, in our conversation, or maybe it's 2 years, maybe it's happening right now, the other side of that coin, right? You've described it earlier where a student wants to go to university usually because they want to come out with that brand, that certificate, that diploma, whatever. And that's a credential that then will make them a valuable or something worth looking at in the job market, right? Are you seeing that in the job market as well, that students who are coming into Watson are they're looking for a different kind of employer? I guess where my question is going is, are you watching the employment market change as well, where people are willing to say, hey, you know what? You don't have the 4-year degree, or you don't, maybe you have some different credentials than what we consider a quote unquote traditional, employee.
Yeah.
Is that evolving as well?
Yeah, without a doubt. And I think we see that firsthand. If you ask employers today what the key skills that they want to see in their team that they're going to be hiring, it's innovation, it's personal skills, it's the soft skills, it's teamwork, it's leadership, it's the ability to solve problems, to work well with others. These are all things that are absolutely core to the everyday experience here at Watson and are very far from the traditional academic experience within higher education. And so we've always found that employers look very fondly upon the fact that Watson alumni have really pioneered their education, because it demonstrates to the employer that this student is a pioneer, that this student is an innovator and a trailblazer. And that's exactly the kind of people they're looking to bring onto their team. So, and I think it makes a lot of sense. There's currently a huge disconnect between, even if you look at the survey data, what institutions think they're doing in terms of the graduates they put into the world and what employers think they're getting when they see a lot of the people who are applying for the jobs. There is a huge disconnect between those two. And I think just by the very nature of the Watson experience, we close that gap. Many students who come out of Watson are also entrepreneuring their own venture and therefore are not necessarily looking for a job at this point, but about 25% of our students choose to be employed within another organization or institution, and their experience at Watson is always a highlight and a huge asset for them in those conversations.
Eric, I feel like, this is unfortunately the first time we've talked, because I feel like we could talk for the next 3 hours. But I've got 2 questions that I end every interview with. The first question is, who do you pay attention to in order to stay relevant, stay knowledgeable, stay energized, stay inspired? Obviously, a great deal of that is going to be your student population. But are there other, are there tweets, are there blog posts, are there individuals, or are there other publications that you'd recommend to our audience about, staying inspired?
You definitely hit the nail on the head with our student population. Getting to see the Watson Scholars come to our campus here in Boulder, learning about the just tremendous track record and impact they've already been able to make, and then their vision for the future is more than we need to stay inspired. Whether it's students who are working to completely change the way elephant conservation is done in the southern part of Africa, to students like Patrick who are creating a whole new industry of local frozen food that brings in more income to local farmers and reduces the environmental impact of frozen foods, to students like Tessa who are working with youth in high schools around the country suffering from severe anxiety, just like she did when she was going through school, and changing the way our education system is designed and built specifically for students who are suffering from severe anxiety. There's so much potential, there's so much motivation, and there's so much impact that we see on a daily basis. So that is a huge source of motivation. I think I try to draw on sources that are also more timeless, so to speak, that I think are relevant across all different ages. So reading stories of people ranging from Mahatma Gandhi to George Washington to Mother Teresa to Aung San Suu Kyi, really the heroes of social change across the ages, right? And reading their biographies, learning about the paths that they took. And just recently was reading more about George Washington, who we, of course, here in the U.S. hold up as the hero of heroes in many ways, right? But what is so fascinating was the number of battles that George Washington lost in trying to gain independence for the future United States, to how ragtag the independent army was back then, to how much self-doubt and questioning George Washington and the other leaders of the revolution did about whether this was the right thing to do. We look back on it and we say, of course it was the right thing to do for the U.S. to become independent from the United Kingdom. At the time, that was not clear at all. When they could barely pay their army, when their army was half starving, half freezing, trying to fight against the most well-funded army in the world, it was really not clear that independence was the best path. Yet they had faith that this was the right way forward. And so reading stories like that really help in those times when either you question the path you're on or you question whether it's possible to do what you're doing. I try to take a lot of inspiration from those people throughout the ages.
That's great. You're the second person on this show in recent time who has looked towards history and classics. I love it. That is fantastic. The last question I have is sort of an opportunity for you to give a shout out. It could be from one of your students. It could be something that, you're just interested in, a side hobby or something like that. But is there an innovation or a shiny new object or a process or a technology or a thing or a person who you're especially interested in that you think deserves a shout out? Maybe they're not getting the press that they need, or maybe they are and you just want to add your name to the voice?
Definitely. All the alumni come to mind. So I'm having a hard time trying to choose one. So it will depend on when this podcast is actually published, but we have an incredible scholar here at Watson named Dwayne Griffith, who comes from the island of St. Martin in the Caribbean. And St. Martin was just devastated by the hurricane. And Dwayne is an absolutely remarkable leader. He is very involved in both the future of St. Martin as a country, but also the work that he does around global citizenship and helping to replace kind of the cultural barriers and divisions with cultural empathy and understanding. And, Dwayne's family luckily is okay, but there's a lot of rebuilding that needs to be done in St. Martin. And he's going to be doing a lot of work around that. And will likely be holding a fundraiser in the weeks ahead to help raise money for the recovery efforts in St. Martin. And so I'd say Dwayne, without a doubt, and not only his work in St. Martin, but all the work he's doing with global citizenship is the one who comes to mind.
Thank you so much for sharing that one. And thank you very much for being a guest on the show today. It's been a fantastic conversation. I wish Watson all the best, and you as well. And I look forward to connecting with you sometime again in the future.
Absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much, Stephen. It's been wonderful to be on the podcast, and I look forward to being in touch.
Hey guys, if you find values in conversations like this one with Eric, please take a second, just give us a like on iTunes or whatever podcast app you happen to be using right now, or share this episode with one of your friends or colleagues through Facebook or Twitter, or hey, just email it to them. And of course, if you have any questions, hit me up at steven@aidpreneur.com. Thanks. You've been listening to the Terms of Reference podcast from Aidpreneur.com. Subscribe to us on iTunes.